Hello, everybody, and welcome to this special Thursday edition of our Tech Tuesday webinar series. My name is Kevin Marhindi, and I am the host of our webinar series that we put on here at Core Tech Services. Joining me today for this Azure cost optimization presentation is Chris Shalda. He is one of our senior solutions architects here at Core Tech Services. Chris has talked about this topic before, but it's definitely one that has been popular with everyone, so we wanted to bring it back up here and give it a little bit of a refresh. So before I hand it over to Chris to have him walk through the presentation he's prepared for today, just a couple of quick housekeeping items. We will be sending out today's recording after the presentation has been completed, so whether you were able to join us here today in person or if you're watching this on demand, you'll have access to the recording so that you can watch it or rewatch it at your convenience. We'll also be sending out a copy of the slide deck so you can refer back to that. And if you do have any questions and you're tuned in here with us today, please feel free to make use of the Q&A chat. You can go ahead and submit any questions there, and as we get towards the end of the presentation, Chris and myself will be keeping an eye on that, and we'll go over any questions you have at that time. Without any further ado, that takes care of the boring stuff. So Chris, let me go ahead and turn it over to you, and you can walk us through the presentation you've prepared for today.
Great, thanks Kevin. Thanks everyone for joining. This is going to be a lot of good information. I've amassed this information from a lot of my interactions with many customers and helping a lot of our customers kind of figure out how to best optimize their costs in Azure, whether they're before they're building a solution or after they built a solution in Azure, kind of taking that experience and distilling this down, hopefully going to give you some guidance and actually some tangible steps you can take in order to get your hands around your costs in Azure. And as you may or may not know, right, Azure is how I look at it in a lot of ways. Since it's a public cloud service, it's a lot like a utility. And think of a utility like electricity or like water, right? And in a lot of ways, like in Azure, it's pay as you go. Same idea like water and electricity. If you just leave the water faucet running, all day, and you didn't need to, right? That's obviously wasteful, and you're going to get charged by the water company for that water, even though you didn't use it. So in the same way in Azure, leaving things on that shouldn't be running all the time, or using something that's larger than you really need, you're going to be paying for that, right? And so what the idea is here, we're going to talk about is right sizing, some tips and tricks around where you can even maybe reserve something ahead of time to save some money. And hopefully this will be some good guidance that will help you along your cloud journey. So where we're going to start today is just some cost savings. We're going to go into this kind of like basic, intermediate, advanced, or like a crawl, walk, run, if you will. Kind of like start here, and then once you get to past the basic, get into the intermediate, then the advanced. Unnecessary cost avoidance we're going to talk about. There's might be some costs that you're just sitting out there. Why not just get rid of those costs? And as well as how do you do the cost tracking? Because how do you know where you are if you can't track it? Then we'll get into a cost optimization offer that's special for people that are watching the webinar here that you might qualify for. We'll talk about that towards the end, and other ways that Core Tech can help you along your cloud journey. And this webinar, like Kevin mentioned, is going to be recorded. You will send out to everybody who is registered for this event, but if you want to check it out later or you weren't registered for this event, you can always hit up our YouTube channel. For Core Tech Services, we have a playlist there called Tech Tuesday Webinar Series. Be sure to subscribe, hit the bell out over there as well to get notified for new videos and content. We're trying to put something out at least once a week, so we're trying to get fresh content out to everyone on a pretty regular basis. So that's a great way to kind of keep on top of that and see what's coming up. And kind of have a caution here. This is a little disclaimer before we get started. Around cost savings, right? There might be other cost savings than just a lower Azure bill, right? Because Azure might be just one piece of what you might think of the TCO, or total cost of ownership, of your overall solution. Or let's say you're a SaaS provider and you have SLAs that you're contractually bound to financially, that if you have services that are down for a certain amount of time, you got to pay back your customers on that. So if you kind of there's other savings there, or potential risk aversions where you may not, it might be somewhere else besides the Azure bill. You might need to spend a little bit more on Azure, and maybe you're going to save somewhere else. So just be aware of that you have to kind of consider everything as far as the total costs are concerned. And be careful of over optimization. You don't want to go and reduce so much that you're impacting performance or poor user experience, or maybe you've cut out so much that you don't have as much redundancy or resiliency that you need. So be careful over optimizing as well. Just be mindful of that. And in general with cloud, it does warrant taking what's called an iterative approach, right? Step by step, you're taking off piece by piece, and it's an ongoing journey. So whenever you're going to be making some major change or new solution, that type of thing, try to focus on what is your minimal viable product with intention to build upon that, iterate, and improve that. The same goes for cost savings. And that's why I've kind of put some of these into the basic, intermediate, and advanced perspective. So be considering that you're going to be starting somewhere, and it's okay to not be like 100%, but get towards 100% of, around governance and cost optimization, but start somewhere. Don't get too wrapped up in, analysis paralysis, not get started. So that's just a mindset change that you kind of have to think through and go through when you're really starting to work with cloud to be successful. All right, so let's just start with the best practices here. And we're gonna start with basic. So this is kind of the crawl mode. First one, everybody who has Azure has access to Azure Advisor. You may or may not realize that sometimes it pings you and bothers you once in a while and say, hey, I've got stuff, recommendations, take a look. Definitely take a look at that regularly. There's an actual section there called cost savings that will give you a lot of great information around even some of the things I'm going to be talking about today. It'll bring those to your attention because it's looking at your resources and how you're using them, whether they're over provisioned, or maybe you have reservations, or there's just something that's not set up kind of properly for costs. It's a great place to start. Another thing we see a lot is cleaning up forgotten or orphaned resources. So when you just delete a VM, let's just say, it doesn't necessarily just delete all the disks that are attached to that VM as well. So you may have disks that you didn't really want to keep around, and those might be orphaned. So you want to go back and kind of clean those up. I know Microsoft's been making some strides on kind of helping you to make a decision when you're deleting a VM to actually select the disk to delete at the same time. So that's a good thing. That's definitely being improved, but you might need to go back, as right now, like, hey, do I have a bunch of these orphan disks? Sometimes like we call them zombie disks, right? Just sitting out there doing nothing, but it's costing you money when you may not need them. You might have extra, storage accounts out there, NICs as well, the network interface cards, right? On the VMs, those don't get necessarily deleted if they have public IP addresses. That's another thing too, but this might be orphaned once you delete a resource like a VM. Look at old dev and testing resources as well. Like, were they there? Do they really need to still be there? A lot of times you might turn something off, but it's still going to be like a VM you can turn off. It's still going to be charging you for the storage underneath. So be aware of that. Other thing is right sizing your resources. Now you should try to do this up front, but you don't always have the luxury of completely right sizing up front because you don't really know how much usage you're going to have. So it's just taking a look at it and making sure that you are right sizing. There's different tools you can use for that. We use things like ahead of time if you're going to be migrating to Azure, using something like Azure Migrate. And there's some other tools you can use within Azure to kind of see where you're at in terms of whether you might be, resources are underutilized, let's just say, and you can reduce the size. So the main thing too is to select the right VM family. So D series is kind of the general one I typically start with, but if you need to have more CPU to RAM kind of ratio, then an F series would be good. If you need more RAM to CPU ratio, E series would be good, like especially for databases. If you have very bursty workloads, as far as kind of CPU is concerned, and they're mostly like not doing anything, and then they burst up and use it, and then come back down, B series might be good to use. Those are very cost effective for those very specific workloads. But I wouldn't just put a B series on everything. It kind of has to be by exception in my mind, that it really does fit that type of size. And there's other guidance here on the different VM families. It's a good link to check out. You can see exactly the size of every single one of these series and what the underlying kind of compute is. There's other things around how much storage you can attach to them, how much throughput, a lot of good stuff. Check out that resource there. Last one here on this page is optimize Azure Blob Storage. So making sure you're selecting the right tier for your needs, right? you may not need to put everything in the hot tier, because that is going to be the most expensive, at least from a total storage perspective. If you're going to have stuff that's going to be sitting around, it's not going to be read a lot, but you need to keep it around, cool or archive even might be better. It definitely is a lot lower cost when you go down that realm if you're not going to be accessing it super often. So consider that. You can actually automate these access tiers. This is with the general purpose V2 cloud storage only storage accounts with lifecycle management. So you can say after a certain amount of time, move to cool, after a certain amount of time, move to archive, so they can handle that lifecycle management on your own, or you can build your own scripts, automation, do it manually, that type of thing too. Make sure you're selecting the appropriate redundancy options. Maybe you had it set for, I don't know, like GZRS, which is like geo-redundant, geo-zone redundant storage, but maybe you only needed, local redundant storage, for example, right? Now this goes the other way around too. Maybe you only have it on local redundant. Maybe you should be considering something like read-only or read access globally redundant. So just make sure you're selecting the right redundancy options for your needs, and don't go more than what you need, of course. So another thing here would be optimize your licensing, especially using Windows Server and SQL Server. If you already have some of that licensing already, which would be something like software assurance, or you have software subscriptions, you should take advantage of those in Azure potentially to reduce the cost of the basically pay-as-you-go. You're leasing a license by the second on Windows Server and SQL Server if you just do the pay-as-you-go licensing. And by purchasing it up front, there could be significant savings there. Yes, you might have to pay for it up front, right? But in the long run, that's what we're looking at, right? Total cost of ownership, and seeing what you can do to lower that. I do have a webinar on demystifying Microsoft licensing in Azure, same place for Tech Tuesday, that playlist. I have a part 1 and a part 2 on that too. So that might help you out in terms of understanding how to best optimize your licensing in Azure when it comes to the Microsoft-based licensing. Use Azure reservations where you can, all right, and where it makes sense. So there's a number of resources out there that can handle reservations. You may be more familiar with like RIs, as some people call them, reserved instances. Those are going to be only for VMs, but there's some storage, there's Cosmos DB, Azure SQL, a number of things I have listed there, and Microsoft's adding more and more. So this makes sense if you believe you're going to be running this resource, or this resource type for, at least a year or 3 years. Because you can get savings. It depends on what exactly it is, but it could be anywhere. Sometimes storage, like just disks, might only be 5%, but VMs could be as much as 40, 50, 60% savings versus the pay-as-you-go. So it makes sense to look at, well, even if I'm going to turn these off a certain amount of time, and not have them on 100% of the time, it might still make more sense to go with a reservation. So you want to look at that from, how much you'd be saving versus how long those would be, those resources would be turned on. That as well, I think I deal with that in the demystifying Microsoft licensing in Azure webinar. And consider also, if you have any VM families like an A series that cannot use like a reservation, maybe you should move off of the A series to something else like F or D series, so that you can use reservations. Something to consider. Now, when you put all that together with the licensing and the reservations, you can save quite a bit. So if you're looking at this in general, you might be paying like pay-as-you-go here, and you just add Azure Hybrid benefit. That because you already have licensing, you're going to save around 40% potentially, right off the top. If you look at, all right, I'm just going to apply a 3-year reserved instance, you might just be saving 72% off the top. You combine those, it could be at 80% savings is a significant amount of savings. So even if you don't have licenses already, that would be a time where you can either purchase them like a license in software assurance, or through a CSP. It's exclusive CSPs. You can do software subscriptions where you can do a 1 year or 3 year for those as well for Windows Server and SQL Server. It definitely can look at that to save some money in the long run. Now we get to intermediate. So this is the walking phase here. We'll talk about more. This is now kind of doing some things around what you already have, especially power management is a big deal, where you would want to potentially auto shut down, potentially auto start some of your your VMs, especially where you're paying for compute while they're turned on, and you want to actually power them off to a deallocation stage when you're not using them. It makes a lot of sense for dev and test, especially maybe even staging where you don't really need them on all the time, maybe only during business hours. So you can do that typically based on a schedule. You can do it based on a trigger. There's some automation runbooks that you can get to integrate into Azure to do that on a schedule. Or we've done things like we've had a demo environment that we don't need on even on a regular basis. It's really like ahead of when we're going to do the demo, we need to spin everything up. And so, we've done something like we have some automation where you create a calendar, you book the resources off of an Exchange calendar, and that kicks off a trigger to go turn like a runbook to turn everything on. And for as long as that that calendar event is set up for, at the end of that calendar event, it then sets a runbook to shut everything back down. Right, so you can kind of manage it that way. We even had approvals in play with that, so you had to be approved before it was, you could book that. So some really great options there. Assess your database usage and sizing, right? Looking at the right, Azure SQL type. Is it, if you're using single databases or Elastic, does it make sense maybe to go to Elastic if you're only using singles to kind of take advantage of the kind of economies of scale there? Hyperscale and serverless might make sense in certain scenarios. So just take a look at that. If you're using Cosmos DB, take a look at making sure that you're using the right, units, collections, replicas. There's provisions are used versus serverless. Now, is making sure that you are sized properly and optimized for that. Another thing I missed saying as well is right sizing wise would be disks. I've had some customers that have had disks that, they created prod environment, tests, stage, QA, dev, all these different environments, but they set the same sized hard disks, like premium disks, for all of those environments where they really didn't need it on the lower environment. So they were paying thousands of dollars more a month because it was just easy to just set the same size of these disks for across the board. Now these are for like SQL servers that did need a lot in the production environment, especially for throughput and IOPS, but the lower environments especially did not need them. So we did a cost exercise for them. They're going to save about $10,000, $11,000 a month after going through that. And file server shared storage. So maybe instead of having a bunch of servers running for file servers, maybe consider using Azure Files, or Nasuni is becoming really popular too, third-party kind of product that works in Azure very natively. You can do distributed files and access from multiple locations, global file locking. There's cache devices even for on-prem. It's a pretty cool setup there if you have some of those needs that are a little more complex. And now to the advanced stage. So there's a running phase. So as we get here, these are going to require a little bit more work, right? And that's why kind of in the advanced side. So start with the basic and intermediate first. But once you get to this point, you can look at maybe modernizing your applications instead of just running all on kind of your traditional IaaS or VMs. Look at refactoring those to shift those over to maybe Azure App Services, Azure SQL Managed Instance. There's a lot of different options. Re-architecting them completely to maybe it's AKS, the Azure Kubernetes Service with containers, Azure SQL Database, single or Elastic from something that was more of a legacy before. Does require more change as we go down here. It becomes a little bit more intensive up front, but the return becomes greater as well. Or you're just rebuilding, right? Obviously higher complexity because you're completely rebuilding, but if you rebuild with cloud in mind and take advantage of things like serverless, Azure Functions, event-driven type of application architectures, you can not only reduce some costs, but improve a lot of capabilities and essentially, maybe in performance and user capabilities, and your overall development lifecycle could be a little bit more agile with that type of approach. I'd recommend you check out my previous webinar on the Tech Tuesdays series, App Modernization in Microsoft Azure. I talk about these a little bit more in detail, so you can check that out. Auto scale your applications. If you're using VMs still, and the VMs are idempotent, meaning they're kind of stateless, you can use something called VM scale sets to scale up and down based off of different kind of metrics of what's being used in those in the kind of that scale set. And if you're using Azure PaaS services, great. many of those PaaS services already have auto scaling natively in there. You just have to turn those on and set those up properly. And client caching and content compression. So since egress is charged when you're talking out to the internet, right, or even to on-prem, unless you have a an unlimited express route connection, you might want to look at utilizing Azure CDN, Azure Front Door Service, to cache some of the content out kind of by the edge, so that the client doesn't have to come all the way back into your kind of Azure environment and pull it back out. In that way is really causing you to pay more in an egress type of fees. So that would be something to look at depending on your type of applications. Right. So now let's get into unnecessary cost avoidance and cost tracking. So this all comes down to governance, governing the costs of what you're doing in Azure. Number one, first and foremost, you cannot track the costs if you don't know what these costs are. And tagging is critical to this. So this is so that you can identify whether a different department, a different cost center, a different project, whether it's, maybe it's prod versus dev, having tags so that you can really slice and dice where these costs are coming from, or maybe you have an owner on that. We've been doing that too for some of our environments internally, is that whenever something gets created, enforce putting a tag on there of whoever created it, because that's not some piece of metadata that's actually there by default. And then consider, you're going to use chargeback or showback models for, when you're doing your cost governance. Are you going to be charging back maybe your end users and customers, just showing it back? Either way, tagging is important. Set up automated budget alerts. There's ways you can do this with Azure Resource Group budgets. You can trigger alerts and run a wide variety of playbooks as well when that budget's exceeded. You can use Logic Apps and run books with Budgets API. There's some good stuff out there in GitHub around that. You do need to estimate your costs for planning new workloads. So what I always recommend, and what I actually help a lot of my customers with, is that when they want to make a change, whether they want to, we need better redundancy, or we want to put in build a brand new solution or adapt a solution that we already have, it's understanding what is the expectation for the costs that it's going to be, so that we can track against that to see, like, are we over and under? And if let's say we're over, well, why? Was it because we didn't estimate properly? Were our assumptions off? Or did somebody do something like put a much bigger disk than it was needed, right? Or much bigger VM size than was really needed. So having a starting point of where you think you should be, because a lot of times you need that anyways for budgeting and, getting approvals to even move forward, that's important. Use the Azure calculator. There's a short link there for that. I'm in that like all the time, but that's very important to do. RBAC and subscription architecture, making sure that that's set up properly so that the right people, have the right access to create the right resources, right? You don't want to necessarily give everybody access to create resources everywhere. Just putting some controls around that is important. There's a little graphic around resource groups, tags, and RBAC. So really it comes down to, usually the finance and business department, they need to be able to break out the costs by different dimensions. So talk to them and ask them ahead of time, what do you need to see? How do you need to break this down, right? And from there, you're going to create certain roles with appropriate permissions in order to create resources. And then you always tag certain things. And you can do this even with policies. Say whenever you create a resource or a resource group, it requires you to input certain tags. And you can inherit tags and a number of things there too dynamically, but at least to ensure that you have all the proper information for tracking purposes. And so usually might do that on a resource group itself. You could go all the way down to the resource level too, if needed. A little bit last thing on Azure Governance here. You don't want to enable shadow IT such that you're going way far to the other side. Like it might have started like we had no controls at all and people are doing whatever wild west, and pendulum swings all the way to the other side, and you're like, nobody can do anything unless they come talk to me. In Azure, that's not necessarily good, because users, like they say in Jurassic Park, life will find a way. The users will find a way, and that will be enabling shadow IT. So empower your users to do what they need to do while governing the spend at the same time would be ideal. Using those Azure policies, like I mentioned, to enforce some of those governance guardrails. So for example, only these VM sizes are allowed in these regions. That's all that can ever be provisioned. So you can't provision the Mega Godzilla sized ones that cost $100 an hour because you don't need it, right? Or maybe it's by exception or something like that. That's a way to kind of protect you a little bit. And also Azure policies to enforce tagging is important too. This does require planning, communications, regular checks to ensure everyone's on the same page. Remember, iterative approach, kind of that graphic on the bottom. It's just an incremental execution. You have to have regular kind of checkpoints and be watching these things. You got to perform the initial forecasting of the costs. You're kind of like making a hypothesis, right? And then you experiment, and then you are checking your hypothesis against what actually is happening. So you're going to be refining those costs ongoing. Just make sure you do that at a decent clip. I would say, definitely review the costs monthly to identify any misalignments or anomalies between the plan that you had and your actual spending, and review and adjust those plans quarterly. In some instances, I'd say at least set up some budget alerts and kind of on the interim, even within a month, just so that you aren't maybe shooting way past it because somebody misconfigured something, so you don't get a surprise on that monthly bill. Now, cost management tools. There's Azure Cost Management that is built into most Azure subscription types out there. Not all of them, but it's coming. That's a first-party tool for that. There's some good stuff in there. There's third-party tools, of course, that you can pay for in order to do some better cost management. Microsoft does offer some Power BI kind of integrations, depending on your Azure subscription types. It's usually for EA type of subscriptions, but there's ways that you can tie that back in and do some slicing and dicing in there. And there's also a Cortex AMS portal. This is something that Cortex created. It's called the Azure Management Suite. This is something that all of our CSP customers, we're an Azure CSP, so a cloud solution provider. So we can provide Azure to pretty much any customer out there, whether it's commercial or government. And we built this tool. I'll show you kind of a screenshot here, that it's giving you some basically transparency around financials of what's happening in your environment. You can set budgets in here. We do some predictive analytics and forecasting for you. And you can see the spend. It's usually within a 36-hour period. This 36-hour lag that you can see what's happening in your environment, so you can catch it before the next bill. And pulling a lot of reports out of here around utilization and whatnot. But as well, we're pulling things in like Azure Advisory, recommendations, Security Center, Secure Score. You can manage your licensing, that type of thing here. So this is a portal that we've created on behalf of our customers because, just to add value for our CSP customers. Most of this has come out of feedback from them. So we've had a lot of good feedback that this is a valuable tool. So now you got all that. You might want to run off on your own, but at the same time, we are offering an Azure Cost Optimization workshop that's for free. So I'll give you some contact information here in a bit where you can reach out and see if you qualify for that. Basically, it's a low commitment on your side in terms of just maybe about 4 hours of just looking at where you're at right now and then reviewing the results. We'll go off and do some calculations and look at what you guys are spending currently and where you can provide you some optimizations there too. So this is something I do for a lot of my customers, kind of on a regular basis, ones that are within our CSP, but we're offering this to even those outside of our CSP. And we do follow the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework. A lot of what we talked about today is kind of in that govern space there, right? And a little bit in the managed space. So this is a lot of what I talked about here is actually recommended from governing your costs and keeping your track of your costs. So you can check out that link below to learn more about the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework. And as I mentioned, we are a CSP provider for both Azure and Microsoft 365. There's a lot of great differentiators that I believe we have over our competitors in terms of what we provide. This is including some support and advisory services. I do a lot of the advisory services for our CSP customers, helping along their cloud journey, architecting, helping them architect solutions, validating designs, doing cost kind of estimates for them, and just being somewhere they can kind of bounce ideas off of. So we have a lot of value there. Let us know if you'd be interested in that. We are an Azure Expert MSP as well, validated by Microsoft. Had to go through a very stringent audit for this. We have a number of staff. We have another staff that's certified for Azure as well. And this is just one of those certifications from Microsoft showing the best partners in the world, where it's only about, I think, maybe 75 of these Azure Expert MSP partners in the world, and we're one of them. And something that we take very seriously, and really just shows that we can really add a lot of value for our Azure customers. So that's all I have right now. As you can see on the bottom right there, there's a couple of ways you can get in contact with either, in general with CoreTech if you are interested in the offer or want to know more about anything that we can do for you with your cloud journey in Azure. And also, if you want to reach out to me directly in LinkedIn, that's fine as well. Please feel free to do that. So let me switch over to questions here. Take a look. And let's see. So here's a good one here. So with reservations, are we stuck if we purchase a certain term, and are we stuck if we purchase these reservations for a certain size for the entire term? So reservations actually in Azure are very flexible. You can actually do some exchanges, and you can return them even up to a certain amount every year with just really a minimal penalty on that. And as well, you can use within the same family, they're actually fractional. So if you have it's like a D8 V3, you can actually do 2 D4 V3s running at the same time to use that one slot of D8. Or if you have 2 D8s, you can do 1 D16. It's all kind of like multiples of each other. So it's very flexible and pretty straightforward. That's something I work with a lot of customers to strategize around the best way to do that. Another one is, what's the best way to get started if we want to modernize some of our applications? So the first thing is an assessment. Obviously, using a partner that knows what they're doing and can kind of help you with that would be probably best. But there are some tools like through .NET, and like if you have .NET applications and some other there's some other languages as well where you can use the Azure App Service assessment tool. There's third-party tools. On the database side, you're going to want to look at like the SQL DMA tool to get started and see what's compatible with SQL, like Managed Instance, for example. But a lot of that guidance is in my previous webinar I mentioned earlier, the app modernization in Microsoft Azure that you can check there. All right. And we had another question here of, can we download the presentation? So if you're registered and you're obviously the person who's asking this, yes, we will actually be sending out a link to the presentation afterwards. So yeah, be on the lookout for that. If you're watching this kind of after the fact, right, and you didn't register for this, then feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I can get you a copy of that if you'd like. All right, well, I think that's it for these questions. Thank you so much for joining us. Hopefully this was valuable. Again, feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or you want to see if you could work with us. We can help you on your Azure journey, cost optimizations or otherwise.
Fantastic. Thank you, Chris. And that'll do it for today's webinar. And I want to thank everybody who tuned in live. For everybody who's catching this on demand, thank you for registering beforehand and getting early access to the recording. We appreciate that. And we'll be back next Tuesday. We're taking a look at SASE, too sassy or not sassy. Jim Hunter, our CISO, will be presenting that day. So if you haven't already registered for that, keep an eye out because for that invitation. If you're interested, you can certainly register and hear what Jim's presentation that he's prepared for that day. So thanks again, everyone. Thank you, Chris. I know there was a lot of great material you covered here, and everyone have a fantastic rest of your Thursday.